Producer Jonah here, and a very warm welcome back to Principle of Charity. Season 2 has arrived, and we've got a truly incredible lineup of guests taking on some of the biggest social topics of the present day. You can subscribe to our podcast to stay up to date, and we'll also keep you posted across all good social media platforms, where we encourage you to join the discussion and lend your insights, feelings, and thoughts on the issues and the episodes.
Well, welcome to Principle of Charity. I'm Emil Sherman and I'm here with my cousin and buddy Lloyd Vogelman. And we've had a great first season of 6 episodes with a really phenomenal response to the podcast. So now, this is a special episode, one that sits outside our normal format. In fact, it sits above our normal episodes, a sort of meta-ep, where we shine a light on the principle of charity itself. Well, we know that principle of charity is about how we approach conversations, right? And so in this episode, we look at what it actually is and why it's so important. We also go one layer deeper and ask whether there are any limits to the principle of charity itself, when it might be problematic or unhelpful to use it. And to do all of this, we have the fabulous Tim Minchin with us. Now, Tim is an Australian musician, comedian, composer, actor, writer, and director. He's best known for his extraordinarily clever and memorable songs, including those on his latest album, Apart Together, as well as his work as composer and lyricist on 2 West End Broadway hit musicals, Matilda and Groundhog Day, both of which won the Olivier Award for Best West End Musical and garnered Tony Award nominations. He's written, produced, and starred in the TV series Upright, and acted on the stage and screen, and is a member of the Order of Australia. But more important than all of that, he came up with the name of this podcast, didn't he, Lloyd?
That's right, Emil. We had the format worked out. We knew we wanted to bring together 2 expert guests with opposing views on big social issues and to frame up a conversation that emphasized both curiosity and generosity, rather than just sound bites and debate. We also knew we wanted each guest at some point in the discussion to present the strongest version of the other viewpoint, as opposed to creating a straw version of the other's argument just so that you can tear it down and celebrate a hollow victory and make yourself feel smarter. We just couldn't work out what to call the podcast. And as I understand it, Emil and Tim, you had what I would now say, a pre-lockdown coffee, and Tim suggested, in fact, I think Emil sort of instructed that we call it a principle of charity. Tim, like us, has long been obsessed with science and reason. He created the wonderful poem book and animation Storm that brilliantly dramatises the philosophy of science. I recommend it highly. He's also a big advocate for the need to have more respectful conversations, where we assume the best of each other and really listen before jumping to righteous disagreement and our own sense of moral superiority. Now, the principle of charity itself, as I know, or as I understand, was established sort of in the late 1950s, coined by Neil Wilson. And I came across it also through the reading of Daniel Dennett, and I use it in my work as a consultant. But without Tim, we wouldn't have arrived at the name for this podcast. So thank you, Tim, and welcome to you.
Welcome, Tim.
Yeah, no worries. I'm proud. And luckily, having suggested that you use the philosophical concept as your name, you went on to make a good podcast. If it had been crap, I would have been embarrassed to be associated with it, and I would have distanced myself.
It's risky. These things are risky.
Very risky, yeah.
Before we start, I'm just going to give everyone a quick sense of the format for this special episode. So I'm going to moderate the first section where we dig into exactly what principle of charity is and why it's important and what, if any, are its limitations. And I'll be asking Tim and Lloyd for their views. Lloyd will then lead the final section, asking Tim and myself some more personal questions, probing how we bring intellectual charity into our own lives or not. So I guess just before we start, I should, given Lloyd is jumping to the other side here as interviewee, I should quickly introduce his background, because Lloyd has quite a unique history. He now runs the Cortex Company, a global boutique consultancy where he works with CEOs and senior executives of some of the world's largest companies in Australia and globally. But prior to that, Lloyd qualified as a clinical psychologist and did a PhD focusing on the dynamics of group extremism. And he's been a visiting scholar at Harvard and other universities. And before that, in South Africa, he was a leader in the fight against apartheid as a member of the UDF, which was a non-racial front of approximately 600 anti-apartheid organizations banned by the apartheid government at the time. He was also the founder of the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, one of the largest trauma centers for victims of apartheid violence. So Lloyd has deep expertise both personally and professionally in extremism, in political activism, and in business culture, all of which turns on the question of how we communicate with people with different opinions. So let's get this show on the road. Tim, talk us through what actually is the principle of charity as you understand it.
Well, I think the principle of charity is basically a sort of, has its origins in the Bible or pre-Bible, in that you should do unto others what you would have done unto you. And the principle of charity basically says, argue unto others how you would like to be argued. And we don't do that naturally because our desire is to be right, and we often have huge investments in our opinions, as we should, because, not just because of our egos, but because of what we're passionate about in the world and the changes we want to see. But it makes us make huge errors, and it makes us assume the people that we are arguing with, we attribute to them illogic, ill intent, often evil, and ignorance. And we do this thing all the time, which is called in philosophy the fundamental attribution error, which is an error we make where we attribute to others their mistakes we say are fundamental to them. This person's done the wrong thing or said the wrong thing. That's because they are fundamentally bad. Whereas when we do or say the wrong thing, we attribute it to a misstep or an error, but it's an exception to the rule. We're fundamentally good and correct. So we do this to other people all the time. We basically assume they're bad and dumb and are in bad faith. And of course, sometimes that might be the case. And I think we'll get to that, the times in which, having a good debate is useless because the other person's not on board with the principle of charity and has other motives. But I think it is less common than we think.
Well, I think that's the point, isn't it, Tim, that some people are acting in bad faith or talking in bad faith, but you sort of won't know if you assume malintent from the get-go.
That's right.
Let's sort of, because the principle of charity works at a number of levels. At a very basic level, it asks us to just assume the most rational and sensical version of what other people say. I mean, it is so hard just to communicate. Even at the best of times, you think of what lawyers do, trying to really foolproof language so that every possible misinterpretation is dealt with. I mean, even on a basic level, Tim, it's difficult to understand what people really intend. You think of emails, you think of all the different ways we communicate. It's hard.
I think it's hard, but I think we pretend it's harder than it is. Yes, it is harder the less nuanced your form of communication is. So when we're talking like this, you two chaps, Emil and Lloyd and I, can all see each other. Unfortunately, we're not around a coffee table, but we can see each other, and we're talking in language. And with language, when we're having a conversation, I can start saying something and then correct myself. I can use my face to show that my eyebrows are up and I'm listening and I'm keen to hear you. And this is a brilliant, evolved, subtle way of discussing things. You take that to the written word, and it's very didactic and sort of prescriptive and lacks some of the nuance of facial expressions and especially verbal tone. And then you take that to a form of written word for which expediency is most valuable, like the email chain, and it gets less subtle and easier to misinterpret. And then you take it to Twitter, and everything's gone to pot because it is much more easy to misinterpret someone's intent in that format.
Lloyd, just to come to you for a second, we're talking about the purpose of principle of charity, the purpose of conversations is getting to the truth, maybe even changing our own minds, which we'll get to. But even if we just want to change someone else's viewpoint, the principle of charity can be helpful, can't it?
Absolutely. One of the things about influencing people, which has become quite clear, both I think in the evidence around influence, is that in general, you don't influence somebody by making yourself look smarter first. It's just, people just don't feel good when you come out and you feel smarter than them, or they are made to feel less smart. The first step in good influence is to build a connection with somebody. And one of the ways you build a connection is by listening to them and making them feel valued.
Yeah.
That is absolutely the first step. And I think the principle of charity, in the way that it allows you to listen and then to value another, builds the connection, particularly in competitive environments. South Africa during its political transition was highly competitive. You had two different forces trying to establish a democracy, or in some cases not wanting to establish a democracy. One of the geniuses of Mandela was his ability to connect with the enemy. He connected at a very, very personal level. There are stories where he would invite people in and make them a cup of tea. I mean, after he had been released. I mean, the ability to connect first is absolutely fundamental. And how you connect is then not just through listening, but actually mirroring that other individual's argument, so that you know that you've got it. You have to summarize their best points.
And they know that you've got it and they feel safe. And then there's the possibility to influence them. I mean, but turning that upside down, Tim, and thinking about how we can change our own minds. Can we actually, how likely is it that we end up changing our own minds by listening to smart, thoughtful people with different views if you enter into a conversation in good faith?
Well, the odds on you changing your mind if you don't are close to zero.
Sure.
Sure. I think Lloyd articulated it perfectly. You need to let other people know that you're listening, and not just listening, but have heard them. And you do that by pitching their argument back to them in the best possible light. Otherwise, you're already stumped, And the trouble with all this is we don't like changing our minds, or at least there is a resistance to changing one's mind because it feels like it's weak and it doesn't give you that big, strong, foundational moral pole that simplifies your life. But actually, I think that's cultural and changeable. I find it very exciting, the idea of changing my mind. That's where I get my buzzes. And look, there's plenty of things I could talk about where I've been, very publicly polemical and not generous to other people's points of views as part of my, satire and stuff. But I'm on a journey. One of the things I'm continuing to learn about is how best to convince, exactly what Lloyd's been talking about, and what the role of polemic is, which we'll get to later, as in contrast to the role of listening and being charitable in your interpretation of other people.
There's a lot of emphasis on how do we change other people's minds using active listening and making them feel safe to change their minds. But as we're saying now, there's sort of less emphasis on how do we change our own minds? Like, why would we think that our opinion is somehow has more validity than other people who are equally thoughtful and smart?
Yeah.
I mean, I want to just talk for a second about intellectual humility and creating a culture which validates mind changing, and where we realize that, look, no matter how certain we are of our own views, if you look back in history, you realize there were a lot of people certain of their views in the past, and their views have been proven to be wrong. And our one thing we know for certain is our views will be wrong at some point. And so to enter into conversations with an almost sort of epistemic, or even like a sort of fundamental humility that we are more likely to be wrong than right, and we need to come into conversations with uncertainty. But how do we stay open, Tim, to that possibility without being paralyzed by doubt and being unable to act? How do we find that balance?
I have got a lot of solace from this very conversation, in that the education I've given myself, and partly at university, about neuropsychological humility, about the ways in which our brains trick ourselves and the ways in which our psychological profiles trick ourselves. Gathering that knowledge gives you a different foundation. It's not a foundation of moral certainty, but a foundation like a grid that holds up the way in which you engage with arguments in the world. So it's not just the principle of charity to me. It's that this is a fantastic place to start. But underneath the principle of charity, and maybe in more episodes we'll go wider in the sort of philosophical tools of argument and listening, but are all these biases that we have, both neurological biases, the way our brain interprets information and, just the vision we're getting through our eyes, and our memories and the massive way in which our memories are flawed, and how we centralize ourselves in our narratives, and how all the different biases we have. This stuff gives me a sense of security, because these are the ideas that have survived 2,000 plus years, and you can always fall back into their arms. And I like it, and that's why I'm an advocate of this sort of conversation, I suppose.
Lloyd, you wanted to say something a second ago.
You can't apply the principle of charity unless you understand how hard it is. To Tim's point a bit earlier, if we go back to evolution, our own biology, we are truly hardwired to be lazy. We are truly hardwired to conserve energy. We didn't run around, millions of years ago trying to do exercise. We were trying to conserve energy in order to survive. And when we found the fig tree, we would eat as much as we could. We don't want to change our minds, because that requires an enormous amount of intellectual and emotional horsepower. We have to go back to that statement, I think, that Jonathan Haidt makes. Morality binds, it makes us feel tribal, it makes us feel good, and then it also blinds. It makes us be delusional about ourselves and about other people. I was very much, in the context of my life in the 1980s, South Africa and the left were very much part of being quite antagonistic towards the West, because the West was seen as colluding with the apartheid government up until certainly 1985-86. And there was an automatic affiliation to the Soviet Union and its satellites. They were seen to be funding the ANC, Mandela's party, and so inevitably there was an appreciation of them. I still have a book that I will not throw out, and it's called Achievements of the Soviet Union, which I read. Now, I keep that to remind myself how delusional I was, and also the importance of changing my mind.
To have a good faith conversation, assuming the best version of the other's argument, it sort of implies that we trust them. Or if we don't trust them, we're giving them the gift of trust. And that maybe is difficult in societies where trust is breaking down. At its core, how important is trust, or is the principle of charity a way to bridge a deficit of trust?
I think it's a really interesting point. And I wrote down, when I was just writing notes on my thoughts about this whole thing, that applying the principle of charity is a radically optimistic thing to do. And I think we must be optimistic. I think the dearth of optimism and generosity and trust is self-actualizing. If we don't trust one another to be acting in good faith and debating in good faith, then it just spirals and spirals and spirals, and we'll get further and further apart. And that's what's happening. So yes, it's a leap of faith that the other person is on board in good faith, and you just have to do it, and you get burned. And often you're the person who's not acting in good faith. You might be. One tries not to be, but sometimes you just want to win. You want to burn the other person. You just want to feel powerful. One's always inclined to do that.
Well, sometimes other people, in the end, are not deserving of good faith, but you don't know unless you give the gift. That is the leap of faith. It's the leap of religion, in a sense. It's the leap of grace. Anything where you are, without being earned, giving something. And it is a really generous act to give somebody the benefit of good faith.
And I guess you have to manage your expectations and manage your feelings. I do it quite often, because I have a public profile on the internet, and sometimes I say things in public and I get a lot of hateful responses, people assuming the most ridiculous things about me. I'm trying to promote vaccines and people are assuming I'm on the payroll of Big Pharma as if they could afford me. These are absurd accusations, an absurd lack of charitable interpretation of my intent. And I try to go back to them and politely and kindly, and it virtually never works, but every now and then you have someone turn around and go, you know what, mate, that was completely unfair of me, and you're right, I was not seeing you as a person. I mean, the principle of charity is a humanizing salve, right? In a world where everything inclines us to dehumanize the other tribe, exactly what Lloyd said. It blinds us as well as binds us. Dehumanizing is the kind of tool of the day, and the principle of charity is a humanizing leap of optimism.
Yes.
We're saying, I want to hear this human because I don't think they're a baddie, because I don't think that's how the world works. And it's a salve in itself. Even if 9 out of 10 times it doesn't work, and even if you fail yourself sometimes, curiosity and humanizing others is a salve. Use that to salve your anxiety, not prescriptive radicalism.
There are forces that are acting against that. Lloyd's talked about some of the evolved forces within our nature, and you've talked about some of the biases. There's also the force of social media, Tim. How has social media made generous conversations more difficult?
Well, I think it's utterly corrupting, and it's hard to talk about because social media has opened doors, has democratized the conversation, has given a voice to the voiceless, has allowed for, the Arab Spring, has allowed for communication, that would otherwise have been blocked, and all this stuff. But long term, we need to be very serious about the side effects of a marketplace of ideas, which absolutely, unarguably, the data all shows it necessarily highlights outrage. There's all these studies that have been done. The more sort of evocative and angry the language you use, the more clicks you get, the more endorphins you get. It is a system of radicalization, without a doubt, and it is poison.
Well, it seems to both, through the algorithms, put us in more and more of our own epistemic bubbles, our bubbles of knowledge. So we're less used to hearing other viewpoints. But then, Lloyd, to Tim's point, it also seems to encourage and spread righteous anger, which is very powerful. Why is righteous anger such a powerful force?
I mean, we are tribal. We like to be in groups. We choose groups. We choose identities, and we need to acknowledge it. That is just who we are, right? Wokeism in itself is tribal. And so it makes people feel good. And so I think righteous anger gives us a sense of esteem. It gives us a sense of tribalism.
Tim, people are told today more than, I think it's sort of quite a new thing in a sense, that if you feel insulted or you're emotionally triggered, then that in itself is a sort of signal to stop the conversation. How do we honor our feelings while still engaging in good faith conversation about things that may trigger discomfort? Whilst you're thinking for a sec, I'm going to give you an example, a personal example, because it really is, it is difficult. I mean, I'm Jewish, and we've talked about this, Tim. Sorry to, I hope you still talk to me. But when people talk about Israel, even though I'm actually hugely critical of many things that Israel does, when I'm talking with people who are not Jewish, I find that my heart rate slightly increases. I start to feel a little defensive, and I get slightly triggered. I don't want to be, but I do. And I then face a dilemma. Do I try to avoid those conversations? Should I use it as an excuse to not engage in conversations that are triggering? Or do you really work at it and try to, as much as possible, acknowledge it, but then also contain it and say that it's more important to have conversations that deal with difficult or triggering emotions than it is to say having the emotion is the reason not to have the conversation?
Look, it's such a good example because you're a very empowered Australian Jewish man, sort of secular Jewish man, and yet you feel sort of psychically tired and triggered by a conversation about Israel. And this is where the conversation about privilege and power comes in, and it's a long conversation for another podcast, but I don't have an equivalent because I can't think of something that is equivalent to me. And I can think of a lot of people I know who have much, much more psychically draining, many more, a disabled person with some able-bodied person sort of gauchely asking questions about disability, or an Aboriginal person with a white person having a strong opinion on Aboriginality when they haven't really thought it through. That there's no doubt there's huge discrepancy in how easy it is for any given individual to be generous when they hear an opposing view, right? There is a difference. However, I still think the goal should be to minimize in your own life, to the extent that you can, the ways in which you the places in which you must disengage. So we all, with our own limitations, our own inherited trauma, we all need to be on the mission to not let everything be something that you won't hear anything else about, So you don't let that become your way of being, if possible.
Yeah.
And some people, it will be their way of being like, fuck you and defensive, justifiably is their way of being. But that's not everyone.
I mean, one almost has to take a sort of a value or a intense statement. Do we run towards pain, or do we run away from it? I mean, that it's pretty binary.
Yeah.
With anything, do we run towards anxiety and try and fix it, or do we move away? And I think what I loved about that example that you just gave is there's an acknowledgement in yourself of how you're feeling. Now, when that already gives you some advantage, because you can actually frame that up in a conversation and say, I am feeling this way, I am feeling defensive, or I am feeling afraid. That already settles the conversation. I think the difficulty, and this comes back to really at the start of our conversation, to Tim's point, what happens when we lack awareness around it? And often during the day, we just do. I mean, when we're busy, when there's adrenaline, when we're outcome focused, we are lacking awareness. And I think just the fact that you know that feeling is massive. And then there's the choice, do you choose to engage or withdraw?
Yes, there's the acknowledgement and the awareness. And then, as you say, is what is the purpose here? Is our purpose to avoid pain, to recognize it and go, we should avoid it, or to say, okay, that's a necessary and unfortunate part of the need to have a conversation? And, you quoted Jonathan Haidt before, but he wrote this book, The Coddling of the American Mind. And he looked at how, we are anti-fragile. Human beings are anti-fragile. You go to the gym, your muscles grow when they're worked, when they're pushed. And the idea that things that trigger us emotionally are inherently going to make us weaker rather than stronger is just fundamentally wrong as a psychological fact. I mean, obviously there are things that are so triggering, so painful that they do make us weaker, but there is a window of tolerance there which we can continually push and grow. And to his mind, we need to continually push and grow that if we're going to become stronger, tougher, physical and emotional creatures.
Let's just go back to your example. Your fear in that conversation may be not true. The conversation may turn out not as bad as you think it will be. And so
probably likely.
Correct. And so anxiety is not the truth. Just because we feel something, it doesn't mean that it is true. You can accept the feeling and not judge it. That's a completely different space to be in, which is probably a good space. But your feelings are not true. They are just feelings. Now, they may be true to you, but it doesn't mean that reality will happen. We know, for example, that anxiety is about negative forecasting. And when you want to reduce somebody's anxiety, it's to stop the forecast that bad things will necessarily happen, which may not be true.
Tim?
Yeah, I think that's really a good point. My brain's just constantly saying one has to acknowledge that this is not an equal playing field. The possibility of being triggered when you're person A and person B are not equivalent. But what I think is true, to come back to your example, one of your choices in that situation, Emil, if you're a not very empowered person, is to use your withdrawal from that conversation as a power grab. So you can say, I feel, God, I hate these conversations. I always feel like I'm meant to, represent the tribe and, all this. Or you can say, I hate these conversations because I always feel like people don't really understand, or whatever. Or you can say, oh, you're talking to me about Israel because I'm a Jew, are you? Well, fuck you, and walk out. And that's a grab. That might be genuinely how you feel. But if you live in a culture where that behavior is rewarded, if we live in a culture where we grow a tribe where outraged, defiant protection against triggering is currency, then we will start doing it more, and it will harm the debate, and it will harm our own strength. How dare you say I should go to the gym? I am proud of my body as it is. You are implying, you are shaming me. It's like, well, you might feel some of those things, but if that gives you power and credibility to say that, then you might be denying yourself a perfectly nice visit to the gym.
That's absolutely right. Sometimes when I look at the validity of a viewpoint or an argument, I think, well, what's the alternative? And I think as painful as some of these discussions are, particularly for people who are disempowered in the community, the question is, what's the alternative? And I think, if you frame it in that sense, you go, well, the alternative is worse than the problem.
Right.
Because the alternative is that you can't have conversations, and you can't have difficult conversations. And we need to be able to, because we live in a society, and by definition, we're going to have people with very different views, and we're going to have people who are triggered and who are disempowered and who do find conversations difficult. We're going to come back to this in a second when we look at the limits of principle of charity. But before we get there, I just want to ask a final question to you, Tim. We've talked about how hard it is to adhere to the principle of charity, how much we have to fight against. And to do that, we need culture. How do we encourage a culture that values listening, curiosity, good faith, trust, intellectual humility? What can we do practically to encourage that, aside from you joining this podcast?
This is a tiny drop in an ocean. It's just an education project. Really, all these things, teaching a way in which one might choose to engage or argue or learn or debate, or, that this idea that curiosity is a salve and that changing your opinion is a buzz, and that neuropsychological humility should be trendy and cool. This is you're selling an idea, which I think is a fantastic and important idea, but it is just how do you spread the word of any, just like we try and spread the word that, Afghan women are going to be horribly mistreated. We're trying to spread information, and unfortunately, it's not very sexy. I listen to your podcast and I love it. And I listen to other podcasts where people are really polemical, and a bit of me wants to go over there and just really get into that.
There's not a lot of righteous anger in Principle of Charity, is there?
No, you want to hear someone just slam. I don't like conflict, but someone without anyone else in the room just slamming an idea. Obviously, it's entertaining. Conflict is entertaining. So what we're selling is a tough sell. It's humility. We're trying to sell intellectual humility. But here's something I do want to say about that. More people are into it. This little kink of ours is a big underground, like the quiet majority. I think most people are into this, but it's just very hard to hear them.
Lloyd, what happens if the aim of a conversation is purely to advocate for political or social change, to really be an activist? And if you feel like you've heard the other arguments, you've considered, you're 100% sure of your view, and you really just want to smash down the door and change society, is Principle of Charity helpful in this scenario?
I think you have to come back to what game you're playing. So, in game theory, for example, there's two primary games. One is a competitive game, which is going to be zero-sum. Somebody's going to win, somebody's going to lose, and sometimes that is the only game in town. If that's what your opponent chooses to play. The other is a cooperative game, which is what we're talking about now. But if the game is highly competitive, and if you have an authoritarian regime or somebody who is not prepared to listen and is locking up people or committing human rights abuses, the principle of charity for me is just not workable. I mean, it's not going to work in every situation. I'm not sure it's going to work in a negotiation with the Taliban. I mean, you can seek to understand their point of view, and maybe that helps a little. But at the end of the day, what is your chosen strategy? Is it going to be dialogue, or do you have to do something else?
Yeah. But I'm reminded of your point about Mandela, who was working in a highly competitive environment trying to bring down a regime, and he still managed to apply principle of charity.
Well, Mandela initially didn't apply the principle of charity. I mean, he tried to. He got... because black people were not only discriminated against, but were, significantly oppressed. When dialogue did not work, he chose the armed struggle.
Yeah. No, that's a good.
And for that, he was imprisoned. When the conditions allowed, he did apply it, and I think he applied it in a very personal way. I don't think it was just political. So I think in a similar way to another South African icon, Archbishop Tutu, he applies, the principle of charity not just in a social sense, but if you spend time with him, you can really feel that he understood and was empathic to even the ultra-right in South Africa. There was something quite saintly about him. That, for example, I just never ever could apply to my own experience of oppressors.
Yep, great. Well, Tim, to Lloyd's point, are there times when painting the straw version, not the steel version, the straw version of the other side is a better strategy? So, I mean, look, we know that when you do that, it's more easy to trick the audience into thinking that you've won. It's a sort of hollow performative trick. I mean, there are also times when you might want to frame a discussion in a way that prohibits and basically closes down options, if you say any discussion of immigration is inherently racist, you are not applying the principle of charity, but you're taking control of a paradigm and trying to foreclose options. Are they legitimate techniques, or are they sort of wrong, moving to the wrong end?
Well, I think your example about the immigration conversation is a good one, because it's surely absurd to say any discussion of immigration is inherently racist. And so it's a good example of one where you might feel morally principled to say that, but unless you just think the world should have no borders, which you might think, but that's a different discussion. But I think the sort of broader conversation that Lloyd is bringing up is that there is a time to go to war.
Yeah.
It should be very, very, very rare that you go to war. And once you've decided you go to war, once you've decided there is no further diplomacy, that we are going to pick up guns or, just words or whatever our weapon is,
tweets,
and that we're no longer going to try and tweet. So we're no longer going to try and reach across the divide. We are at war and we're going to use violence. Then at that point, you must use all your powers of rhetoric and persuasion to dehumanize the other side. You need to get all your soldiers in front of you and say, those people, those krauts, they're evil. This is what they do. And, and they're on their side, they'll go, these Jews, and they'll pass around cartoons and so you must dehumanize the other side if you're going to go to war. Now, as I described that, surely every listener is in there going, well, that should be very, 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 very last resort. And yet again, I want to acknowledge that the energy required to do diplomacy is more, is easier when you have more privilege and more power. But, you said earlier, what's the alternative to the principle of charity? The alternative to the principle of charity is war. And I actually mean that literally. The end point of ever-increasing tribalization down moral grounds is literal war. It has to be. It has to be. So I think, yes, there are times to go to war when the other side is evil, but it can't be very common.
Well, I think also to decide whether to go to war or not, you need to apply the principle of charity first. You need to actually seek
Well,
to
you need to
understand
gather
first.
all the information.
You need to understand from their point of view. You need to present the most generous version of their argument. If at that point you still feel justified, then that's a very different decision to deciding to go to war when you haven't tried to understand what they are intending in the best possible light.
That's right. When you're only going to war because you've pre-dehumanized them by not ever trying.
I mean, the principle of charity, doesn't allow for your brain to just fall out of you. I mean, you still have to have a brain. Otherwise, you're going to get things very, very wrong about your opponent.
Yeah, and we are, I mean, just to state the obvious, the principle of charity does not advocate, assuming that all opinions are equally valid. And it doesn't advocate coming to one truth and one conclusion. I mean, that is not what it's about.
Yeah,
it's actually, about a way of approaching conversations. Tim, another example of the limits of principle of charity or challenge to principle of charity, you might call the sort of woke argument, which is, is being able to discuss things rationally, to put aside our emotional triggers and to aim for reasonableness. And that sort of, Enlightenment, rational ideal, really just a form of white privilege. I mean, even, there's been arguments that sort of rational ideal is a form of white supremacy speech, privilege of a certain class of people, a way of marginalizing voices who may not have the luxury and the history and culture of being able to have this sort of discussion. Now, we've touched on this before, but do you think it's a valid counterpoint or push against the principle of charity?
I think it's a really understandable one.
Yeah.
I can sit in that position. Let me skip to my conclusion briefly. I think it's horrendously racist, but let me start from a less inflammatory statement. I can sit in a place where I understand that listening to a bunch of middle-aged white guys, all of whom have tertiary degrees and a bit of philosophy and psychology, training, there's no doubt that would feel like you are being kicked out of the room, and people like us are saying, well, you can't engage unless you know how to, check your confirmation bias and have neuropsychological humility, and don't create straw men, and you've raised your voice, settle down, this tone policing that goes on with people like us.
You're too emotional.
It must be infuriating. And it must be acknowledged. However, the idea, so because of the patriarchy, because of colonialism, because of guns, germs, and steel, because of Euro-industrial revolution, because of infinite factors, there's no doubt that over the last couple of 100 years, a lot of ideas and inventions will have been attributed to or created by people with white skin and penises, right? Because of the circumstances.
It's the fact of power,
That's right, and we can analyze how bad it is that that's the case, which obviously it is. Inequality and Eurocentrism and colonialism, we all understand now, has huge problems. But that doesn't mean we should throw the philosophical baby out with the equality bathwater, right? So, penicillin or the principle of charity or synthesized psilocybin or tampons or, it doesn't matter who invented these things. We can assess whether they're good or bad, right? And I would put in a category of good ideas are the ideas that we call Enlightenment ideals of rationalism, of reason, right? The Enlightenment was the rise of the era of reason and tolerance, and these ideas didn't come from the French in 1780. They were accumulated. They're in the Bible. They're in the Greeks. They're in Egypt. These ideas were accumulated by people of all genders, sexes, colours and persuasions over time, and they went through a mimetic evolution, They became ideas that survived, and they became the ideas from which classic liberalism flourished, right? And to say that these ideas of reason and enlightenment, not for black people, is horrendous to me. And if
it's
a black
patronising
person,
as well. I mean, it can be seen as patronising.
Yeah, I find it difficult to even talk about, because I understand if a person of colour says that, I can't just discard their experience. But if I was a different person of colour who really loves his Hume, I'd be furious. How dare you say the color of my skin prohibits me from engaging in the ideas of the Enlightenment and being a good diplomat? Are you saying that because of the color of my skin, I should just be angry and passionate, and I'm not allowed in the room of enlightenment, of reasoned discussion, of philosophy and psychology and neurological humility? Like it's crazy, that stuff.
I mean, to push further into awkward territory, Tim, is there a positive of being privileged and not being triggered and having the luxury of being able to have reasonable and open conversations? There's an argument that being an outsider or being less drawn in to the dangers of these conversations can give us a vantage point to maybe get to the truth more easily.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm way too aware of the possibility that my intention in these conversations could be deliberately or accidentally misconstrued to speak too much to this.
Yeah.
But I think I can say that the idea we talk about, this privilege idea, it's become this absurd situation where people think privilege is something you need to excoriate yourself for, that you need to be ashamed of. That's a misconstrual of the importance of the idea of privilege. Privilege is something that you should be very wary of, and I am hyper wary of it because I don't believe in free will, so I know that every single thing about me is luck. Being aware of privilege allows you to think about how best to use it. You shouldn't bury it and shame yourself for it. You should utilize it for what you see to be moral good. One privilege is the privilege of having education. It's perhaps the greatest privilege. This sort of tacit idea I hear from some sort of binary, political radical people, that you should not just check your privilege and acknowledge it, but kind of hide it and punish yourself for it, is absurd. If you have the privilege of education, regardless of where you come from, your obligation is to try and apply it in a way that you think is moral.
And there's an argument that, we want more privilege. We just want to democratize it, don't we? We want everybody to be privileged, everyone to have the privileges, rather than to feel that privilege is a sort of shame as much as it is as well.
Of course.
Okay, well, we're gonna shift gears and make this a little bit more personal. We've spoken quite a bit about the principle of charity from a conceptual principle point of view, if you will. I'd like to make this a little bit more personal and talk about the principle of charity from a experiential point of view with respect to both of you. But before doing so, bearing in mind, Emile, I am going to ask you some personal questions. Let me give an introduction to Emile. Emile is the founder and managing director, or joint managing director, of Seesaw Films. Seesaw is a global film and television production company. It has won so many awards, Academy Awards, Emmy Awards, Golden Globes. You may have seen some of Seesaw's productions, The King's Speech, Lion, Top of the Lake. But importantly, with respect to other parts of Emile, Emile is a director of the Ethics Center. He is on the board of the Animal Protection Institute Voiceless. He's a former director of the Sydney Writers' Festival. He holds a law degree. He has a master's degree in English literature. Importantly, as you would have discovered, and I know from family dinners, he's obsessively curious about ideas, sometimes a little too so can lighten up a bit, but then the same critique has been made of me. Tim, I'm going to come to a point that you made earlier about yourself. A lot of your career is based on being polemical. Some of your work is quite angry. I think of the Pell song, the Cardinal Pell song, stuff about Scott Morrison. How do you incorporate gentleness or charity into your work when, in fact, some of your career is based on being angry?
Yeah, I could be really long and boring about this. I mean, I think there's hypocrisy in it. One tries to be a certain way and isn't always, and one develops into beliefs and leaves some things behind. So I have comedy in my past that was a bit cruel when I was sort of had no career, and I kind of found that being edgy got me an audience. On the other side, I've done work that I look through a utilitarian lens at. So the greatest good for the greatest number. So in terms of the work where I've personally attacked people, there's virtually none. I attack ideas, and sometimes I personify those ideas in a straw person, like in Storm. Storm isn't a person. She's an amalgamation of a million ideas, and it's deliberately she represents the furthest away point of what I'm arguing about deliberately. It's called I think they call it a Socratic dialogue, right? You create Socrates, or maybe, Socrates used to have a character that he would argue against, that he would imbue with, like a straw man, with all the ideas he agreed with, just so he could make him look like a fool in his dialogues. But it was generated from nothing. The Pell song, so this is about when you decide to go to war. So the privilege that a person like Cardinal Pell and the institution of which he is a leader has been so great for so long. And one of the greatest privileges is they are protected from normal everyday language. For example, if a tennis coach was accused of shuffling kids around to different tennis camps that he owns or runs, when he knows that there's pedophiles in all these places, we would use incredibly strong language. The papers would be full of evil, pedo, scum, blah, blah. But the church is protected from that because he wears a fancy hat. And I made a conscious and incredibly carefully researched decision to raise money for abuse survivors to go and see him testify, because he chucked a sickie, right? And no one was using normal everyday tennis coach language, and I did. And it was shocking because it wasn't even very strong. But, I also felt confident because I spent 15 years hating that Pell's homophobic rhetoric and his sexist rhetoric. And I also am not religious, so I don't give him any credence whatsoever for his position of power, because I don't think God exists. So I think it's all a sort of I'll take that back. There's a lot of good stuff about church structure, but so that's an exception. Then there's a bit of hassling ScoMo, which was very gentle and was a song written by Briggs that I wrote a chorus for. But and the other exception is Donald Trump, and I shouldn't have been one of the billions of people on Twitter saying I was just like, I hate this man so much, I just have to say it in the public square. I wouldn't do that now. That was useless, utterly useless to do that stuff. Apart from that, you could probably go through everything I've ever created and you won't find me being personally insulting to people, even when they were calling me lazy, dull-bludging, stoner, faggot scum on the internet. You won't find me.
Yeah. Tim, as you speak, I'm struck by how personally aware you are of yourself. Where does this come from?
I guess my genes. I have a very measured father. My privilege, as in I have felt very, very angry in my life, but it tends to be on behalf of others. I have my kids have both been tested recently cognitively, because one of them is autistic and the other one's a bit interesting neurologically as well. And they both have this sort of blown sense of justice, their justice module in their brain. And so I think that might come a bit down my line. But I'm also a needy, pathetic, self-righteous, fucking pathetic. I really, really want to be, I feel very motivated to not just be good, and that causes me a lot of distress trying to figure out what that means, but to be seen as good, and that's the less generous bit of it. Yeah. And so I work on it. I mean, I work on trying to be good, and I work on trying to be seen good.
Emil, I'm going to move over to you. Yeah. What triggers you to get morally righteous, judgmental before you listen? And you can talk about me as well, by the way, if you want to. I'm sure I trigger you.
Well, I'd say two things. First of all, I think I really enjoy arguing, and I like getting heated up. But I find I have a style where I seem to be more argumentative than I actually am. I'm more just enjoying. I like to have someone I'm discussing with who's equally passionate, and I like tossing ideas around and I like changing my mind. And so my style can seem a bit argumentative, and so I can get wound up when I'm talking with people who have that style, and it can seem like, I've gotten really heated and emotional, but actually inside I'm just having a good time, and people can misconstrue that. What triggers me now, idea-wise, and I am a bit ashamed of this because I don't want it to be so, but I know where it comes from, is I find identity politics very triggering for me. And as much as I really, and in some cases, and with some people, I argue hugely in favor of the importance of a whole range of things that come out of identity politics, I just was not trained that way at university. I was trained by spending years doing sort of cultural theory and postmodern theory to think that identity is everything that's wrong. Identity is what white supremacy rests on. Identity is power, and that we need to disrupt anything which points to the essential nature of identity, whether it's culture, tribes, groups. And so, I'm watching a show called The Chair on Netflix at the moment, a brilliant show, and my wife's loving it. But just the world of identity politics makes me feel just really stressed. I just feel stressed about it. As much as my head takes over and goes, it's a perfectly reasonable debate and conversation to have.
Tim, I can see you want to say something here.
Oh, no. I mean, I think people of classically liberal, Enlightenment educated people of all colours and creeds, I shouldn't have to say that, but I do because
of our age group.
Of
I
our
think
age
is an important
thing.
Thing.
Of people probably above the age of 30 all the way to the dead people all the way back 300 years have a genuine anxiety that we're going in, that this is a misstep. And so that's a whole other podcast. But yes, I'm the same. I have genuine anxiety that it's a misstep, but I don't have a problem applying the principle of charity because there's a lot to hear.
And there are a lot of great ideas within it. And there's a lot of great challenges to things that we assume to be true.
And I can salve my anxiety by listening more, not less. My concern, which is real and abiding, ongoing, that more tribalizing is not a great idea, and we should go back to trying to ignore each other's differences as much as we can, whilst acknowledging the differentials in privilege. There's just I can offset my anxiety by going deeper into the other side, and that's the lesson.
Now I have to get to this question that I want to ask both of you. My wife has been in the arts for a long time, as both an actress. She now writes musicals, and I want to ask both of you this question. I sometimes find, and maybe I am stereotyping here, but I sometimes find people in the arts who tend to be quite left-leaning, just as social scientists tend to be quite left-leaning, very judgmental about people when they don't dress well or haven't read the right book, and they're not so fancy. What's going on here?
I think it's a really interesting question, and I think you might be suffering from a bit of confirmation bias. You might notice it in them more. You might have at some point early on noticed that, and now you gather that data. And
now I'm seeing it everywhere.
Yeah, now you're seeing it everywhere. But I would say that increasingly one's politics are part of one's brand. And people ostensibly, I can't stand right-wing people saying, because people make assumptions about my politics because I understand climate science and have long hair. People throwing out lefty snowflake and ABC, this and that in Australia. It's just, I find it like, oh, geez, we're not 12. You just have to do better than that. However, I do understand how unattractive the left can be from the outside, because that champagne lefty accusation doesn't come from nowhere. It is there is a lot of social justice branding going on. And so a correlate that you've observed between people who kind of are quite like, you have to dress like this and eat like this and be loudly Black Lives Matter square posting loudly vegan, whatever. It is very human. One's tribe and one's brand are increasingly intermeshed, I think, and maybe that's what you're observing. They're kind of you can be very social justice oriented without being a particularly nice person, I guess. Just like you can be a very nice gun-toting, right-wing Christian.
That's a fascinating point.
Emil, what's your view?
I think it brings up a really interesting point, Lloyd, which is that I think a number of years ago, the artistic impulse, people with artistic sensibilities, the artistic force was one of expansiveness, of breaking down boundaries, of not following the rules. And it has become, and that's one thing which has shifted in the left, that the left and artists are, often in this case as well, are grabbing onto purity, are holding onto purity as something of value. Whereas before it was that anarchic spirit, which is something that they identified with. And I think that has really been a shift. And, when Tim, you talk about, you're maybe never practice exactly what you think in your head and you don't live up. I mean, I think there's a sense that we can have fun. We can not be consistent. We can not be pure. We don't need to be pure. Maybe social media is pointing out our contradictions, but what's so bad about contradictions? What's so bad about being inconsistent? I mean, I'm not saying that entirely seriously, but I think there is a beautiful force of anarchy and disruption which links to lateral thinking, it links to creativity, it links to coming up with new ideas. And that has been the force of the arts. And if the arts moves too much to a force of, I have worked out ahead of time exactly what I need to think, and so I'm now writing a book or a play or a musical to service that particular ideal, things get a bit boring. And I think we might feel that we are more worthy for it, but less people are going to watch the stuff because humans are messy, humans are inconsistent, and we want to see that on our screens.
Yeah. No, I think that's good pushback to me with respect to that observation. I think it really highlights that this came to a point that Tim was making earlier, very early in this conversation, is I need to be, in this case, more charitable to imperfection. Yeah. You can't apply the principle of charity if you don't understand percentage improvement. If you just think people need to be perfect and great and never have done things wrong and never have to be angry or have made mistakes, that is where we're getting with this, what I think is the cancel culture that we've alluded to. On that note, Tim, when Emil was talking about privilege, what I was also hearing was, I'm a little afraid to touch on this. It could get misinterpreted. Bearing in mind that the principle of charity attempts to seek the truth, how much are you holding back in yourself in conversations, particularly because you're such a public figure, because you are afraid of the backlash or being cancelled?
I think I'm holding back in helpful and unhelpful ways, as in helpful to me and society, as in people like me. And look, I've been, I did an interview with Stan Grant recently, which he started with, you grew up rich. And I didn't want to say, well, but, I grew up with, camping holidays only and secondhand cars, and I just went to a good school. And, when I left school, my parents gave me $500 to my first car, and that's the last dollar I ever got given. And I never got a scholarship. I never took a grant. I never got the dole. I literally taught myself how to play piano. I've never had a lesson in acting, composing, lyric writing, comedy. I think I should be allowed to claim some level of self-actualization, even though I believe it's all a causal chain from the Big Bang. But anyway, so I sort of resent being put in a box where I'm so sort of privileged that anything I say is, sort of moot. But that said, I think it's good that people like me pause before they pontificate. And you listening to this podcast, you might laugh out loud, but I do pause a lot. And I do think the capital P privilege idea has a positive effect in that way. It makes me stop and think about really whether my voice is the right voice right now. On the other end of the scale, I don't say a lot of things that I think are probably perfectly reasonable and considered ideas because I am scared of having what I say taken out of context and someone will attempt to publicly shame me. And I don't like the phrase cancel culture because everyone says, well, no one's cancelled. Look, he's still got a job. And it's like, let's talk about public shaming as a mechanism for change and what the slippery slope of that is. So I will in time, and I talk about it on stage because people all have their phones off and they're just listening and I can keep context around it in the live situation. But when I'm being recorded, I'm definitely more cautious in some helpful and some unhelpful ways because of a fear that someone not applying charitable intent, deliberately using what I say to feather a tribal point, will try and shame me. And I suspect I'm a little oversensitive about that. I think people underestimate the potential negative effects of shaming being a dominant mechanism of change. And I think they underestimate the effect of what it feels like to be on the end of it. People are like, oh, it was just a few comments. And it's like, nah, until you've had thousands of people abusing you online and felt that magnet, that inability to look away, it feels incredibly emotionally distressing. And we do it to each other very, very casually. And so, yes, I'm cautious because I don't believe most people will have charitable. I believe there are a scary percentage of people who will not have a charitable interpretation of my intent when I talk about anything slightly on the edge of contempt.
As you were speaking, I could just feel my own fear increasing. We've probably agreed that there will be people that we should not apply the principle of charity to. At some point, we need to judge them. They may be incredibly prejudicial. They demonstrate consistency in their prejudice. They're quite hurtful sometimes in their prejudice. What happens when those people are family members? Why are we more charitable to the family than to others?
I guess a really interesting question is whether we should treat everybody like family. Think of that as a thought experiment that we can hold contradictory views about people in our family where we love them, but we hate their ideas. It's interesting to think about what that would be like if we held it with our workmates and we go, we love them, but they hold some ideas we don't like, with people in our neighborhood, with people in our city, with people in the country, people internationally. Obviously, the further removed people get, the less trust there is, the less we know them as human beings. So we just have the ideas that we dislike. But, truly great people, and you talked about Archbishop Desmond Tutu, do seem able to recognize the humanity in people and hold that humanity at the same time as disagreeing with their views. And we know that when people live in different neighborhoods, and there have been studies which show in America, as I understand it, that people with different views are much more polarized geographically, that it becomes harder to feel that sense of family with people who have different views. And so you stop being used to that. That muscle that we have developed in our family, we lose the power of that to approach all human beings like that. And I guess I would hope that we can exercise that muscle more and more strongly, because it's a beautiful muscle to have, to go, you know what, I love you, but I really hate that idea of yours, and I'm happy to have dinner with you.
Great idea. Tim, over to you.
I think the first thing I said on this podcast is that the principle of charity is basically an extension of do unto others as you would have done unto you. And, connected to the more Christian stuff, the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. I mean, it seems so obvious that it is fridge magnet level trite. But whenever we engage with one another in public discourse, on the internet, in real life, we should say to ourselves, how would I treat this person if they were my brother? And we should ask ourselves, if someone I love was treated like I am treating this person, would I be okay with it? If your desire to punish someone, to shame them, or to withhold from them any possibility of forgiveness for something they've said or done, or an idea that you think is abhorrent, if you applied that across the board and it was applied to you, would the world be a better place? These little hypothetical questions, and exactly as Emil posed it, these should come down in front of our face like a lens, like a filter, every time we engage. Now, sometimes we will err. Sometimes we will be too angry and too emotional to apply to others the dignity and humanity that we want applied to ourselves. And you will have reasons for that. But every single time we fail, it's a failure. We were wrong to fail every time. And that's what I say to myself. There were good reasons why I was so angry. This and that in my past, and, that triggered me. But that doesn't mean you let yourself off. That doesn't mean you go, well, they deserved it. You were wrong. You were wrong to not offer them the humanity you would expect back. And we have to hold ourselves to account in that regard, surely.
Great. I think on that note, we're going to close it. Tim, thank you so much for giving us your time. More importantly, thank you for giving us the name of this podcast, and also for being a great supporter. Thank you, Emil. Thank you, Tim. If you haven't seen, by the way, Tim's Storm video, animation video, it is just great because it really does focus on a lot of what we're talking about today.
Thanks. You guys are great. Keep doing your podcast.
That was great. Appreciate it.
Take care, everybody. Cheers.
If you enjoyed the show, we'd love you to leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. It really goes a long way to helping others discover our conversations. You can also find Principle of Charity on social media, where we hope you'll join the discussion. See you soon.